For too long, the American spirit has been dimmed by a veil of secrecy, by a government that has grown too comfortable in the shadows, denying us the transparency we deserve. But today, we stand at the dawn of a new era where the light of truth begins to shine through. A few weeks ago, President Donald Trump made a historic announcement. With the stroke of a pen, he committed to declassifying the files concerning the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a decision not just monumental, but pivotal. It is with profound honor that I have been entrusted by Speaker Mike Johnson and Chairman James Comer to lead the House Oversight Task Force on Declassification of Federal Secrets. Together with the help of the White House, our intelligence allies, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, we will be conducting investigations into the following: the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and Dr. Martin Luther King, unidentified aerial phenomena, also known as UAPs, unidentified submerged objects, also known as USOs, the Epstein client list, the origins of COVID-19, and the 9/11 files. This will be a relentless pursuit of truth and transparency, and we will not stop until the American people have the answers they deserve. We will cut through the bureaucracy, challenge the stonewalling, and ensure that the American people finally get the truth that they have been denied for too long.
That's the voice of a Florida congresswoman named Anna Paulina Luna, and she's speaking there at a press conference that was held on February the 11th this year, where it was announced that Congresswoman Luna has been appointed as the chairwoman of the House Task Force on the Declassification of Federal Secrets. Luna is 35 years old, and she's had a pretty meteoric rise in Republican politics. She's only been in Congress since 2023. Before she was elected, she served in the Air Force and had some success as an online influencer, and she did some swimsuit modelling for magazines like Maxim. In her modelling work, Luna was fond of heroing the American flag. Sometimes she wore a swimsuit while standing in front of an American flag. Sometimes she wore swimsuits with the stars and stripes actually printed on them. You can also find numerous photos online of Luna posing with a semi-automatic firearm, and sometimes even with two semi-automatic firearms, although I'm not sure whether these photographs originated as modelling shots or as campaign literature. Until she became Trump's declassification czar, Luna's most significant act in Congress came in January this year when she introduced a bill proposing to have Trump's face chiselled onto Mount Rushmore. As we heard in that clip, Luna has promised that her task force will be declassifying government files about a whole smorgasbord of juicy conspiratorial things, but as her first order of business, Luna announced that she would be declassifying all the remaining classified government files about the big daddy of conspiratorial obsessions, the JFK assassination. This is how Luna described her mission at that press conference.
This will be a relentless pursuit of truth and transparency, and we will not stop until the American people have the answers they deserve.
To the untrained ear, that sounds like pretty good stuff. I mean, surely we all agree that the pursuit of truth and transparency is desirable, no matter who it is who happens to be doing the pursuing. In this case, a bit oddly, it's the administration of Donald Trump that's on the warpath for truth. Luna's Declassification Task Force was formed to fulfill a promise that Trump made on the campaign trail last year. He promised, quote, "When I return to the White House, I will declassify and unseal all JFK assassination-related documents. It's been 60 years, time for the American people to know the truth." Trump put the word truth in capital letters there to emphasise just how severely interested in the truth he is in this particular case. But something strange is surely going on when Donald Trump claims to want to know the truth in capital letters. Trump certainly likes saying the word truth, but his contempt for the concept of truth is pretty well known. As we saw in the last episode of the podcast, it was an openly stated aim of the first Trump administration to flood the zone with bullshit. Trump isn't just a man who's chronically unable to tell the truth. He seems to be a man who doesn't even grasp that objective truth is a thing and that facts are non-negotiable. You can't make a fact go away by making a deal with it. G.K. Chesterton wrote that the truth exists whether we like it or not, and it's up to us to accommodate ourselves to it. Trump does things the other way round. He doesn't believe something is true unless he likes it. And when he doesn't like the truth, he refuses to even see it, let alone accommodate himself to it. So when Donald Trump issues a call for truth in the Kennedy case, I think we've all got a right to be sceptical. Donald Trump issuing a call for the truth is like Ron Jeremy issuing a call for monogamy. It's like Keith Richards issuing a call to live clean and lay off the drugs. So what's going on with Trump's pursuit of truth and transparency in the Kennedy case? Is this just a way of flooding the zone with yet more bullshit, or is it possible that Trump might actually be doing the right thing here, even if he's doing it for the wrong reason? Surely, as a student of the JFK case, I'm not about to criticise Trump for giving us more information about the case. Surely more information is always a good thing, even if we don't like the people who've ordered the release of that information. In an ideal world, I would agree that the release of these files is an unequivocally good thing, even though I strongly doubt that they're going to tell us anything earth-shattering. But unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a world whose most powerful democracy is being run by a group of sinister crackpots and clowns, and I don't think that the declassification of these JFK files can easily be separated from the motives and the credentials of the people who are doing the declassifying. And I think we need to understand from the outset that Trump's supposed quest for truth in the Kennedy case is premised on a gigantic falsehood. Trump says that it's finally time after 60 years for the American people to know the truth about the assassination, but that call for truth is in itself a grotesque lie. The truth about Kennedy's assassination has been known for 60 years, or at least it's been available and knowable for anyone who's honestly interested in hearing it. Kennedy was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald, and there's never been any conclusive evidence that Oswald was involved in a conspiracy. The problem with the Kennedy assassination isn't that the truth is not known or that we need more information or evidence about it. As I've shown over the course of this podcast, Kennedy's murder is almost certainly the most lavishly documented crime, not just in American history, but in the whole criminal history of the world. The problem here isn't that the truth has never been established, it's that the established truth has never landed with the American people. It's never stuck. The opinion polls have always shown, and they still show, that at least half of the American population believes that Kennedy was murdered by some kind of conspiracy, even though the evidence has never indicated that. There are several reasons why the truth about this case has never cut through with the American people, but the main one is that the conspiracy theorists and the denialists, the intellectual forefathers of people like Donald Trump and Congresswoman Luna, have never liked the truth about the assassination, and they've worked very hard to make sure that the truth has never been allowed to land. So if the huge mountain of evidence that we already have about Kennedy's murder has never made much of an impression on the American public, or enough of an impression on the American public, what are the chances that when this final batch of classified files is declassified, the truth about what's in them is going to land? In the current age of misinformation and disinformation, what are the odds that when Congresswoman Luna tells the public what she's found in these files, or what she thinks she's found in these files, what are the chances that she's going to admit that she's found nothing useful in them and the lone gunman explanation was true all along, and we can all now relax and finally put the case to bed? As somebody who's familiar with the history of this case, I have to say that the chances of that happening are zero. In fact, I think I already know what's going to happen here. Conspiracy theorists are going to tell you that these files contain clinching proof of conspiracy, even if they don't, and those conspiratorial claims are going to be amplified by Congresswoman Luna. So how do I know that that's what's going to happen? Because it started to happen already. Luna has been amplifying conspiratorial claims and talking points since the day she announced that she was heading up this task force. Whether she knows she's doing it or not, she's been using moves that come straight out of the playbook of classic conspiracy theory. Listen again to the promise that Luna made at her inaugural press conference.
We will not stop until the American people have the answers they deserve. We will cut through the bureaucracy, challenge the stonewalling, and ensure that the American people finally get the truth that they have been denied for too long.
So the way Luna tells it, the American people have never previously been given the answers they deserve in the Kennedy case. They've been denied the truth, and she's the one who's finally going to deliver it. She's talking as if Kennedy's murder has never properly been investigated before. She's talking as if she'll be starting her quest for the truth from scratch. All this is complete nonsense. What she's doing in reality is vowing to unearth the truth about something that the truth has been unearthed about already. And that is a statement of pure historical denialism. And denialism is the starting point of all conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory is always an exercise in looking away from a reality that the conspiracy theorist doesn't like, and it's an exercise in trying to make other people look away from that reality too. If you listen to all the things that Luna's been saying about the assassination, it seems that the established truth about it is completely invisible to her. It's just not there as far as she's concerned, and it never was. In an interview with Glenn Beck, Luna used a telltale catchphrase of denialism. She said, "I am simply asking the questions that every American has been asking for decades." There's a name for people who insist on re-asking questions that have already been answered a million times before, and the name for that kind of person is a conspiracy theorist. If Donald Trump established a mathematics task force and the chairwoman of that task force publicly asked if 2 + 2 might really equal 5, and then added, "I'm just asking questions here," I think we would see straight away that some questions are not legitimate, and I think we'd have a right to ask some questions of our own, such as, why do you find it necessary to ask this question at all, and why have you chosen this particular moment to ask it? What is it that you're trying to distract us from? Mind you, there is at least one important difference between Congresswoman Luna and most of the Kennedy conspiracy theorists who have gone before her. The early Kennedy conspiracy theorists really knew their onions when it came to the assassination. You can say what you like about the sanity of their conclusions, but nobody could accuse the pioneering Kennedy conspiracy theorists of not being thoroughly steeped in the evidence of the case. The early denialists bitterly disagreed with what the Warren Commission had said about the assassination, but there was never any danger of them forgetting what the Commission had said, or of not knowing what it had said at all. With Donald Trump and Congresswoman Luna, though, you're dealing with people who have a fairly frightening level of historical ignorance. These people are so confused about reality that it's hard to know exactly what goes on in their heads, but whether they know they're doing it or not, what they've been doing in their public comments about this case is erasing long-established historical truths about things that they clearly know nothing about. Certainly Congresswoman Luna's inquiry is going to be a pretty strange sort of inquiry, given that she already seems to have ruled out accepting any answer that resembles the answer that we already have. She's vowed to finally provide the American people with the answers they deserve, but the implication of that vow is that she's already decided that the Oswald answer is no good. It's off the table, it's out of bounds. Whatever the answer is that she comes up with, it's not going to be that one. In fact, I haven't heard Luna mention the name Oswald so much as once in all her public statements. Unfortunately for her, although she might find the Oswald explanation boring or politically unuseful, it does happen to be true. And that means that any alternative answer that Luna finds or thinks she finds is going to be false by definition. This whole quest of hers is a pseudo-quest, and any answers it claims to find are going to be pseudo-answers. This is not an exercise in transparency and truth-seeking. It's an exercise in misdirection and obfuscation. But Trump and Luna have already primed the American people to expect big revelations from these files. And we all know what happens when Donald Trump expects to see something. He's going to see it, and he's going to insist that it's really there, even if it really isn't. Whether Congresswoman Luna is aware that her quest is a pseudo-quest is another matter. My gut feeling is that she probably doesn't. In Trump's MAGA cult, the techniques and tactics of conspiracy theory have been internalized. The conspiratorial worldview is just the default position. We're talking about people here who openly prefer fiction to fact. We're talking about people who positively want to live in a fantasy world where history is a cartoon and where the deep state goes around stealing elections from presidents it doesn't like and shooting other presidents it doesn't like. Conspiracy theories like this can be dangerous and even lethal, whether the people who are spouting them seriously believe in them or not. It's a moot point whether Donald Trump sincerely believed that the 2020 election was stolen from him, or whether he just repeated that lie so often that he eventually came to sort of believe it. But it's not a moot point that people ended up dying in the Capitol building as a direct consequence of Trump peddling that lie. Refusing to accept reality can be an extremely dangerous business, and we should always aggressively push back against anyone who makes a habit of doing it, unless, of course, that person has been formally diagnosed as insane, in which case we should probably give them a break. Here's something else that Congresswoman Luna has said about her task force. She said, quote, "The task force and the transparency this is providing is long overdue. The reason that you have such an array of theories is because the government was not transparent." Again, Luna is blaming previous governments here for something that's really the fault of people like herself. The reason why we have such an array of theories about the Kennedy assassination is not because the Warren Commission and other government inquiries were not transparent about it, or because they failed to provide ample proof of Oswald's guilt. The reason that we have such an array of theories is that for 60 years, people precisely like Congresswoman Luna have done their very best to stop the clear answers that those inquiries delivered from being heard. As for transparency, the Warren Commission was remarkably transparent given the information that was available to it. Compared with the loose and ignorant way that Luna has been talking about the Kennedy assassination, the Warren Commission was a model of rigour and sanity and probity and rationality and transparency. It's true that certain other government agencies, including the FBI and the CIA, double-crossed the Commission by withholding important information from it and even by actively lying to it. Those agencies certainly weren't fully transparent with the American people. I'll give Luna that much. But this is very old news. We've known for decades that the FBI and CIA told lies to the Warren Commission. But when the lies they told were exposed in the 1970s, the exposure of those lies didn't weaken any of the central conclusions of the Warren report. Just because those agencies told some lies to the Warren Commission, that doesn't automatically mean that there was a conspiracy. This point needs to be underlined. I mean, it's not a very hard point to understand, and yet people like Congresswoman Luna seem to be terminally confused about it. The lies that we know the FBI and CIA told the Warren Commission were not told to conceal any material information about who killed Kennedy. They were lies about satellite issues, and the reason these agencies told these lies was to cover their own asses and conceal their own incompetence and illegal conduct. Take, for example, a story that I told back in episode 7, the story of the FBI agent James Hosty. After Oswald returned to America from the Soviet Union in 1962, the FBI put Oswald under loose surveillance in Dallas. And James Hosty was the FBI agent who was assigned to keep tabs on him. When Oswald heard that Hosty had been questioning his wife Marina, Oswald got very cross and he wrote a threatening note to Hosty and dropped it off at the local FBI office. We'll never know exactly what that note said because Hosty was ordered to destroy it after the assassination, not for any sinister conspiratorial reason, but because the FBI was afraid of being seen to have dropped the ball in its surveillance of Oswald. It had known that he was an erratic and potentially violent man. It was meant to be keeping tabs on him in Dallas. And yet when President Kennedy came to Dallas, the FBI didn't warn either the Secret Service or the Dallas Police Department that Oswald might pose a threat to the president. The truth about the FBI's destruction of Oswald's threatening note to Agent Hosty came to light in the 1970s when the House Select Committee on Assassinations reinvestigated Kennedy's murder. But the committee's discovery of this FBI lie didn't change the fact that Oswald had killed Kennedy. In fact, it only served to reinforce the lone gunman story. The FBI had lied because it had failed to guess what a lethal threat Oswald posed. The story of Agent Hosty and the Oswald note is slightly convoluted, but when you know about facts like this, you can take yourself beyond the sound bites and brain farts of people like Donald Trump and Anna Paulina Luna, and you can replace their paranoid and cartoonish sense of the way history works with a grown-up understanding of how it really works. In real life, the fact that agencies like the FBI and CIA were not fully transparent in their dealings with the Warren Commission really isn't all that surprising or unusual, and it doesn't automatically mean that there was a conspiracy behind the assassination. Nor does it mean that the Warren Commission itself was not transparent, given the information that was made available to it. In fact, the Warren Commission's problem was that it was too transparent for its own good. As well as publishing its 888-page report about the assassination, it also published 26 companion volumes of evidence and exhibits, which contained transcripts of all the testimony that the Warren Commission had heard. The Commission made a rod for its own back by being that transparent because there was something for everybody in those 26 volumes of evidence and testimony. Along with all the solid and compelling evidence that was in there, there was also a lot of junk, flimsy, unreliable evidence. And since conspiracy theorists always prefer flimsy junk evidence to good evidence, the Warren Commission had inadvertently given its critics decades worth of material to chew on. I've tried to be as fair as I can to the Kennedy conspiracy theorists in this podcast. I've tried to make it clear that in the early days of this case, there were some legitimate unanswered questions about the assassination that gave people a right to suspect that there might have been a conspiracy. I'm fairly sure that if I'd been around at the time of the assassination, I would have suspected a conspiracy too, given some of the unanswered questions that were left hanging in the air for 9 months while the Warren Commission went about its business. But when the Warren report was published, all the important legitimate questions that the assassination had raised were given legitimate answers. And all those legitimate answers pointed away from conspiracy, not towards it. The publication of the Warren report was a watershed in the history of Kennedy conspiracy theory. Before the Warren Report was published, it had been fairly reasonable to doubt that Oswald alone had killed the president, but the Warren Report addressed and squashed all of those reasonable doubts, and from then on, the Kennedy case became a forum for unreasonable doubt. The conspiracy theorists who continued to doubt the official story after the publication of the Warren Report doubted that story not because there was anything intrinsically and demonstrably wrong with it, but because they had psychological or political reasons for not wanting it to be true. Most of the leading early conspiracy theorists in this case were pronounced left-wingers who simply refused to believe that a Marxist assassin would have had any reason to murder a Liberal president. Those early conspiracy theorists were misguided, but they were far from dumb. They knew that the claims they were making were pretty radical, and in their books and articles and lectures, they did their best to disprove the official story using detailed and closely reasoned arguments. In the end, none of the arguments that were put forward by the best and brightest of those early conspiracy theorists ended up being decisive. As hard as they tried, they never did end up blowing up the Death Star of the official story. But they did succeed in creating a general sense that there was something fishy and not quite right about that story. The Kennedy conspiracy theorists fired their best shots at the official story a long time ago. By about the mid-1980s, the movement had almost entirely run out of intellectual steam and intellectual credibility. But the general non-specific stink of conspiracy that these people generated around the assassination is still lingering in the air even today. And this general sense of confusion has always been very useful to any charlatan or demagogue from the left or the right who has an interest in distracting people from reality. This brings us back to Congresswoman Luna. I don't want to be too hard on this woman because she's only supplying qualities that the American people for some reason seem to want in their politicians right now. But since Luna is currently marketing herself as an authority and expert on Kennedy's assassination, I do have to be honest and say that her credentials to pronounce on this case are close to non-existent. As we're going to see, Luna has got an alarmingly flimsy grasp of the case's basic facts. She knows a lot less about it than I do, and if you've listened to the podcast up to this point, she also knows a lot less about it than you do. Even if you're new to the podcast and you listen to this episode only, I guarantee you that by the end of it, you will have a firmer grasp of the facts of this case than Congresswoman Luna does. JFK conspiracy theory has sunk to a fairly sad intellectual low if Anna Paulina Luna is now the official voice of the movement. It's reached the end of the road, or perhaps the bottom of the barrel. Luna has not brought any new evidence to the table yet, and she certainly hasn't brought a new level of brain power to the table in her analysis of the old evidence. All that she's brought to the table is her very cartoonish Trumpian worldview, where the world is a very simple place and evidence can mean anything you want it to mean. That's what's new here. The fact that these people with this astoundingly low level of brain power are suddenly in power. They're not handing out leaflets on the grassy knoll. They're not issuing their brain farts on their own private blog. They're members of Congress. They're running government task forces. They're close personal friends of the president. They are the president. There's something paradoxical about the current state of conspiracy theory in America, and Congresswoman Luna is a walking embodiment of that paradox. On the one hand, conspiracy theory has never been dumber. On the other hand, it's never been more powerful. The world's most important democracy is not just being run by conspiracy theorists, it's being run by people who aren't even very good conspiracy theorists. Since we're being transparent here, I should probably admit that I'm getting fairly tired of talking about this shit. When I recorded the previous episode of this podcast, I wondered if I'd said all that I had to say about the topic of JFK's assassination. But the epic story of JFK conspiracism never ends. It goes on, and it's just taken a brand new twist. Donald Trump has put it back into the headlines. So although I'm maybe getting slightly tired of talking about it, it's suddenly become more important than ever to keep talking about the facts of this case sanely and rigorously and with as much good faith as we can muster. Because if people like me don't do that, that's going to leave the field free for people like Donald Trump and Anna Paulina Luna and RFK Jr. to recycle and exploit and weaponize all of the tattered old lies and misunderstandings about this case that have been hanging around it for decades. People like Trump and Luna and RFK Jr. never get tired of saying the shit that they say. They love the sound of their own ill-informed voices. They positively want the sane people like you and me to get exhausted and give up. And that's why we have to stay in the fight and keep insisting that the truth matters. So one more time, I'm David Free, and this is The Ghosts of Dallas. As I've said, we don't live in an ideal world. And the main reason why I find it hard to be overjoyed about Trump's declassification of these JFK files is that I know how badly people have twisted and misinterpreted the available evidence about the assassination for the last 62 years. The release of more evidence, no matter how trivial and meaningless and beside the point that evidence is only going to give people more material to twist and misinterpret and misrepresent. But let's pretend for a moment that we do live in an ideal world. Let's forget about the Trumpian context of this file release, and let's pretend that we live in a world where everybody respects the authority of fact. In that ideal world, the release of these files would indeed be a good thing, because everybody would correctly understand what's in them and fully accept what's in them, no matter what they say. So what is the correct way to look at these files, according to me? First, you have to accept that there is such a thing as knowledge. There's a framework of facts in this case that we know to be true because they were established beyond doubt long ago and they have survived decades of assault from the skeptics. If you have a realistic sense of what we already know about the assassination, then you're going to have a realistic sense of what these remaining classified files might plausibly tell us and of what they're certainly not going to tell us. To understand this factual framework that I'm talking about, we have to remind ourselves what the Warren Commission concluded about Kennedy's murder. Its core conclusion was that Oswald killed Kennedy, and it provided ample proof for that conclusion. But despite what a lot of people think, the Warren Commission did not positively assert or claim that Oswald had not acted as part of a conspiracy. As the Commission correctly pointed out in its report, it's very difficult and perhaps even impossible to prove a negative, to prove that Oswald was not involved in a conspiracy. I mean, how can anybody prove on paper that Oswald during the last months of his life never at any point, even for 5 or 10 minutes, talked with any other person or persons about his plan to murder the president? It's technically impossible to prove that that didn't happen. That's why the Warren Commission did not formally conclude that there had been no conspiracy. All it said was that it had been unable to find evidence of any conspiracy. It wasn't the Commission's job to do the impossible and prove that there was no conspiracy. And if the conspiracy theorists are so sure that there was a conspiracy, it is their job to prove that. And that really should not have been very hard if there really was a conspiracy, because evidence of that conspiracy would have existed. This is the way things should always work with any claim of conspiracy. When a conspiracy theorist claims that a conspiracy occurred in any given case, it's not up to the rest of us to prove that there wasn't a conspiracy. It's up to the conspiracy theorist to prove that there was one. In the Kennedy case, the official story, if you want to insist on calling it that, is not that Oswald did it alone. It's that Oswald did it and there's never been any evidence that he didn't do it alone. The Warren Commission did not rule out the possibility that evidence of a conspiracy might one day emerge, but given the Commission's thoroughly proven conclusion that Oswald killed Kennedy, that does put a very strict limit on what kind of conspiracy might realistically have happened in this case. It would have to have been a conspiracy involving Oswald, a conspiracy that fits in with all the facts that we know about Oswald and with all the actions that we know he performed. He picked up his rifle from Ruth Payne's garage the night before the assassination. He took that rifle into the depository the next morning. He built his sniper's nest. He fired all the shots that hit the motorcade. He fled the scene without assistance from any other person, and he shot J.D. Tippit in Oak Cliff, and then he fled that scene and was arrested inside the Texas Theatre. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Oswald did all of those things. There's never been any credible evidence that anyone helped him along the way, and we don't need to imagine that he had any help in order to comprehend what happened. Our understanding of the assassination is complete without the need of any conspiratorial explanation. But if evidence of a conspiracy does exist somewhere in some long-hidden file or document, we know that it would have to be a conspiracy that's compatible with all of these established and unerasable facts about Oswald. To put it another way, our picture of the assassination is a lot like a jigsaw puzzle. The Warren Commission started off with a box full of unassembled pieces. By the end of its investigation, the Commission had put together all the pieces that came in the box, and the picture that those pieces formed when they were put together showed the leering, self-satisfied face of Lee Harvey Oswald. But the Commission had no way of knowing whether there were any pieces missing from the box when they began their work, so they couldn't positively say that the picture they assembled was complete and that no additional pieces of the puzzle would ever be found. That's why the Commission wrote in its final report, quote, "Because of the difficulty of proving negatives to a certainty, the possibility of others being involved with either Oswald or Ruby cannot be established categorically, but if there is any such evidence, it has been beyond the reach of all the investigative agencies and resources of the United States and has not come to the attention of this Commission." That was a fancy way of saying that while the Commission had put together all the pieces of the puzzle that it had, it didn't know for sure if there had been some pieces missing from the box to begin with. I find this jigsaw puzzle analogy quite useful because it helps us to grasp a few important points. The assassination may have been a puzzle once, but it's not a puzzle anymore. Once you put the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together, it's no longer a puzzle, it's a picture. Since we don't know if there were any pieces missing from the box to begin with, we can't say for sure that our picture of the assassination is fully complete, but we do know that if any more pieces of the puzzle do one day come to light, they're going to be edge pieces, not central pieces. They're not going to replace Oswald in the middle of the picture. At the very most, they might show us that there were other people in the picture as well as Oswald. behind him or beside him. But they're not going to put someone in the picture instead of Oswald. The thing about a jigsaw puzzle is that the pieces can only be put together one way. You may not like the fact that when the pieces of this puzzle were put together, they showed Oswald's face, but that's too bad, because if you take the puzzle apart and put it together again, it's never going to show you a face other than Oswald's. That's the sane way to look at the declassification of these JFK files. Nothing in them is going to change the unalterable fact that Oswald shot Kennedy. There's a very remote chance that they might tell us something we don't already know about Oswald and his motivations, and there's an even remoter chance than that they might show us that Oswald conspired with others. But that is it. The realistic way to look at this last round of declassifications is that it's really just an administrative tidying up exercise, which is highly unlikely to yield any information of value. But Congresswoman Luna has been talking as if these files are going to deliver the key to all mythologies. In a radio interview she gave in February, she was talking about a particular document that her task force is looking for, and she said, quote, "That document itself is going to be key for our hearing whether or not we find out who actually pulled the trigger." I'm going to talk later on about the document that Luna was referring to here. But for the moment, let's linger on the phrase, whether or not we find out who actually pulled the trigger. That is how illiterate Luna is about the facts of this case. That's how contemptuous she is of all the painstaking forensic work done by the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. She seems to think that after all these years, we're still at square one and we don't even know who pulled the trigger. The idea that Luna is going to find something in these files that shows us that somebody else other than Oswald pulled the trigger is an utter fantasy. It's not the belief of somebody who's living in reality. Now, I need to pause here to clarify something about the declassification of these files. Up until now, I've been talking about this exercise in the future tense. I've been talking about what these files will or might reveal. But I should make it clear that the bulk of the actual declassification of these files seems to have been done already. Donald Trump has promised that 80,000 pages of documents will ultimately be released, and as I record this podcast, 60,000 of those 80,000 pages have now been dumped online. But just because these files have been dumped online doesn't mean that we already know what they say and what they mean. These are raw files which are not word searchable, and they haven't been indexed yet. So it's going to take experts and pseudo-experts a fair while to report back on what these files say or what they think they say. But so far, the information that's been revealed by these files has been so peripheral and so inconsequential that I would bore both of us to tears if I talked about these files in too much detail. So I'm just going to give you one example of the kind of thing that's been revealed by these files, and then I'm going to move on. The example I'm going to talk about was cited in a recent article in The Atlantic by an assassination researcher named Caitlin Tiffany. It's got to do with a CIA document that concerns a CIA officer named James P. O'Connell. O'Connell has no known link with Oswald or the assassination, but when a previous bunch of government documents was declassified in 2017, it was revealed that the CIA had once had a fake driver's license made for O'Connell in the year 1962, which gave him the fake name of James P. Olds. Now, when the document containing this piece of CIA trivia was declassified in 2017, part of the document was still redacted. And now, thanks to Donald Trump and Anna Paulina Luna, that redaction has been removed to reveal that the state that this fake driver's license was fake issued in was California. If you think that this sounds like it doesn't matter in the slightest, you're right. As Caitlin Tiffany said in her Atlantic article, the information that's been revealed here is, quote, an irrelevant detail in an irrelevant document. It certainly sounds very sexy and exciting when you hear that the government is about to declassify a CIA document that is, quote unquote, related to the Kennedy assassination. But the unsexy reality is that the CIA is in the business of keeping secrets and that it classifies documents all the time for operational and procedural reasons that are unfortunately very boring. And just because the CIA happens to have filed a given classified document among its JFK records, that doesn't mean that the document is related to the assassination in any meaningful way. Back in February, when Congresswoman Luna announced the formation of her task force, she said, in previous investigations, they didn't have access to the information that we are going to have access to. So that's a big deal, especially if you're looking at what truly happened with JFK. Like pretty much every claim that Luna has made about the assassination, there's a lot wrong with that one. Technically, it's true that the Warren Commission didn't have access to the information that, say, the CIA made a fake driver's license in 1962 for a guy named James P. O'Connell. But if it had had access to that exceedingly trivial piece of information, it wouldn't have wasted more than a second or two thinking about it. The Warren Commission was staffed by a group of highly competent attorneys who knew how to distinguish between useful information and useless information. These attorneys at the Warren Commission had a level of smarts and rationality and plain common sense that the Trump administration seems to be bent on stamping out of American public life forever. If Congresswoman Luna thinks that the Warren Commission's investigation was fatally impoverished because it didn't have access to the kind of trivial information that she's been declassifying, she's dead wrong. She's the one whose investigation is going to be impoverished because she seems to have decided from the outset that she's going to simply ignore and dismiss the mountain of good quality evidence we already have that points to Oswald and away from conspiracy, and instead she's going to go chasing after imaginary, as yet undiscovered scraps of evidence that just might, if she ever gets her hands on them, give us an answer more satisfyingly Trumpian than the answer we already have. I've spent many hours in this podcast trying to define exactly what conspiracy theory is, but when I listen to the vacuous and inane public pronouncements of people like Donald Trump and Congresswoman Luna, I begin to wonder if I've been overthinking the whole thing. Maybe conspiracy theory is nothing more than a simple disrespect for fact. Maybe it's just a way of ignoring reality and believing whatever you want to believe. Of course, there is a bit more to it than that, in that what makes conspiracy theory different from other forms of wish thinking is that what conspiracy theorists specifically wish to believe in is conspiracy. They want to believe, for one reason or another, that there are conspiracies everywhere. But before you even get to that specific element of the Trumpian worldview, you can't help noticing the basic contempt for fact and reality that facilitates this ideology. People like Trump and Luna are just chronically incapable of relating even the simplest fact about this case without either getting it wrong or putting some idiotic personal or political spin on it. Trump and Luna want us to believe them when they claim that the American government has systematically hushed up the truth about Kennedy's murder. And that's a very radical claim. If it was true, it would cause us to revise not just our understanding of this case, but our whole sense of how American politics and history work. So anyone who makes this radical claim must either know something very big about the case that nobody has ever known before, or else they don't have the slightest idea what they're talking about. Trump and Luna don't have the slightest idea what they're talking about, and it shows. They can't seem to utter a single, simple, declarative sentence about the assassination without managing not just to mangle the English language, but to get at least one basic fact embarrassingly wrong. Let's listen to some more of Congresswoman Luna in action at her first press conference.
Our first investigation will be announced, but it's going to be covering on a thorough investigation into the John F. Kennedy assassination. And I can tell you, based on what I've been seeing so far, the initial hearing that was actually held here in Congress was actually faulty in the single bullet theory. I believe that there were two shooters.
Luna makes a couple of huge claims there at the end of that sentence. She claims to have discovered evidence that the single bullet theory, the theory that's central to the claim that Oswald was the lone gunman, she claims to have found evidence that the single bullet theory was, quote, actually faulty. And then she goes on to add, not just in the next breath, but in the same breath, that, quote, I believe there were two shooters. If Luna has really discovered evidence that backs up either of these two massive claims, then she's made some truly sensational breakthroughs in the case. We're going to see that she hasn't, although I don't doubt that she might well think that she has. But if she thinks she has, that's just because she has an extremely loose sense of what evidence is. I've said before in this podcast that conspiracy theorists get the big things wrong because they get the small things wrong, and the clip I just played illustrates that point perfectly. At the end of the clip, Luna makes two massive conspiratorial claims. The single bullet theory was false, and there were two shooters. But listen again to the small thing she very casually gets wrong as she's building up to these larger claims.
Based on what I've been seeing so far, the initial hearing that was actually held here in Congress was actually faulty in the single bullet theory. I believe that there were two shooters.
What is the, quote, initial hearing held here in Congress that Luna is talking about and that she presumes to be finding fault with? The word initial suggests that she's talking about the inquiry of the Warren Commission, which took place in 1964. That was certainly the first formal inquiry into the assassination, but it was a presidential commission. It didn't take place in Congress. So maybe Luna is talking about the House Select Committee on Assassinations. That investigation did take place in Congress, but the House Select Committee on Assassinations was not established until 1976, so it was not the initial inquiry. And it didn't come up with the single bullet theory either. It did endorse the single bullet theory, but it was the Warren Commission that came up with the theory. So on balance, I'm guessing that when Luna talks about the, quote, initial hearing that was actually held here in Congress, she's talking about the Warren Commission. I'm sure that Luna's fans would think I'm being a terrible snob and pedant when I point out that she doesn't seem to be all that clear on the difference between the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. But I don't happen to think that her verbal sloppiness is a side issue. Her inability to speak coherently about the assassination and about reality in general is a reflection of her inability to think coherently about the assassination and about reality in general. She just doesn't have trouble handling words. She has trouble handling facts. And I don't think that it's an act of snobbery to believe that facts still matter and that the boss of a high-profile fact-finding task force should be able to get her basic facts straight. And anyone who's spent any time reading about this case will know that the difference between the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations is a pretty embarrassing thing to get mixed up about. In the glory days of Kennedy conspiracy theory, there was never the slightest chance that any critic of the official story would forget the name of the dreaded Warren Commission. The words Warren Commission and Warren Report used to fall trippingly off the tongue of even the most mediocre Kennedy conspiracy theorist. Congresswoman Luna is claiming to have made breakthroughs in this case that have eluded all of those previous conspiracy theorists, and yet she can't even remember the basic entry-level cliches of the conspiratorial case. But let's move past Luna's confusion about simple historical facts, and let's listen to how she completed that thought about the single bullet theory. At the end of this clip, you're going to hear her use the word SCIF, which is an acronym, SCIF, that stands for Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility.
Based on what I've been seeing so far, the initial hearing that was actually held here in Congress was actually faulty in the single bullet theory. I believe that there were two shooters, and we should be finding more information as we are able to gain access into the SCIF, hopefully before the files are actually released to the public.
Back in February, when Congresswoman Luna briskly unveiled her belief that there were two shooters, this was greeted in some quarters as if it was serious news. The Daily Mail called it a, quote, bombshell revelation. In other places I've seen it said that Luna has, quote, announced that there were two shooters. On the internet, panels of conspiracy theorists went into a lather over Luna's so-called revelation or announcement. For years, they said, the government has told us that there was only one shooter, and now Congresswoman Luna, with her privileged access to the files, has finally found proof of what we've been saying all along. There wasn't just one shooter, there were two. But if you listened carefully to what Luna said, she didn't exactly say that she'd found proof or evidence that there were two shooters. She said, I believe that there were two shooters, and we should be finding more information as we are able to gain access into the SCIF. In other words, Luna has not discovered, after looking at the new evidence, that there were two shooters. She just believed that there were two shooters as an article of faith before she'd even gained access to the new evidence. And she also believed as an article of faith that the evidence was inevitably going to back her up. Her claim that there were two shooters was not a revelation, let alone a bombshell revelation. It was a guess. It was a brain fart. But even though it was a brain fart, as a stickler for detail, I can't help wondering if one of these two imaginary shooters that Luna was talking about was meant to be Oswald, or was she talking about two entirely new shooters, neither of whom was Oswald? Luna, of course, didn't address that question, probably because she doesn't even realise that it is a question. As I've said, Luna is not big on mentioning Oswald's name. And anyway, if she does think that two shooters, not including Oswald, killed Kennedy, that's still a long way off breaking the record. Jim Garrison once claimed that Kennedy was shot by 5 gunmen, none of whom was Oswald. As long as we're being pedantic, I also wonder how we're supposed to square Luna's statement that there were two shooters with her other statement, which she made the following month, about how she hoped her inquiry might find out, quote, who actually pulled the trigger. How is it that Luna can claim to know that there were two shooters while simultaneously claiming not to know who pulled the trigger? It sounds like the kind of question that Buddhist monks ask themselves when they're meditating. But actually, this kind of disdain for logic is standard practice in conspiracy theory. It's conspiracy theory 101. In conspiracy theory, any narrative will do as long as it doesn't correspond to established historical fact. In the Kennedy case, the established historical fact is that there was one shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald. So, for the conspiracy theorist, it's acceptable to believe that there were two or more shooters, but it's also acceptable to believe that we just don't know who pulled the trigger and possibly never will. What isn't sayable for the conspiracy theorist, or even thinkable, is that the lone gunman answer has been true all along. For the conspiracy theorist, 1 is the only number of shooters that there cannot have been. Congresswoman Luna is a pure, unadulterated conspiracy theorist when it comes to this case. Her public pronouncements about it could hardly have made that clearer. Her inquiry is not about pursuing the truth, it's about obscuring and denying an existing truth. I can't tell you what conclusion Luna is going to say that she's reached at the end of this inquiry, but I am willing to bet that one thing she certainly won't be saying is that the boring old lone gunman story was true all along. To be fair to Luna, she has publicly mentioned 2 pieces of evidence that would seem to at least vaguely support her claim that the single bullet theory is faulty. But before I talk about those 2 pieces of evidence, we should probably refresh our memories about what the single bullet theory is. I gave a detailed account of the history and finer points of the theory back in episode 9 of the podcast, but to remind ourselves of the basics, we need to remember that Kennedy wasn't the only person in the motorcade who was hit by a bullet that afternoon in Dallas. The Texan Governor John Connally, who was sitting in front of Kennedy in the presidential limousine, was also struck and wounded by a bullet, although his injuries were not fatal. On the Zapruder film, both Kennedy and Connally can be seen reacting to their respective injuries, and when staff at the Warren Commission slowed the film down and analysed the reactions of both men, they noticed something significant about the timing of their reactions. The film shows Connally reacting to being shot in the back approximately 1.8 seconds after Kennedy reacts to being shot in the back. But as the staffers at the Warren Commission knew, Oswald's rifle was not capable of being fired twice accurately within that 1.8 second time frame. So the Commission's initial analysis of the Zapruder film suggested to them that Oswald couldn't possibly have shot both Kennedy and Connally, which meant that there had to have been a second shooter. Naturally, the staffers at the Warren Commission were alarmed by this apparent revelation, but they were also quite baffled by it because they hadn't discovered any other hard evidence that pointed to a second shooter. All the other evidence, including the medical and ballistics evidence, suggested that Oswald alone had fired the shots. So after they'd pondered this little mystery for a while, the Commission's staffers came up with a hypothesis that seemed to tie all the available evidence together. They knew that the bullet that hit Kennedy in the back had exited through his throat, and they wondered if it was possible that the same bullet, after exiting Kennedy's throat, had then gone on to hit Governor Connally in the seat in front of Kennedy and to cause all of his injuries. This was the single bullet theory, and as the Commission's lawyers tested this theory against the evidence, they found that it was more than just plausible or tenable. They found that it was actually quite clearly the true explanation of what had actually happened. As I demonstrated in episode 9, it's been evident for about 5 decades now that the single bullet theory is a lot more than just a theory. It's a proven conclusion. It's an established historical fact. All the available evidence converges on it and confirms it, from common sense evidence about the positioning of Kennedy and Connally's bodies in the car to micro-scale evidence about the weight of the bullet fragments that were found inside Connally. So when you look at how snugly all the evidence converges on the single bullet theory, you understand that it's about as true as any theory can possibly be. There's simply no way in the physical world that it could not be true. So when Congresswoman Luna suggests that she's found evidence that the single bullet theory is actually faulty, we can say with a very high level of confidence that she's wrong and that the evidence she's seen doesn't really mean what she thinks it means. She is right about one thing, though. If the single bullet theory is wrong, that would indeed mean that there were two shooters. The Warren Commission freely admitted that, and that's the reason why the early conspiracy theorists tried so extremely hard to disprove the single bullet theory. Some of them went right down into the micro realm and constructed some very detailed and ingenious arguments about bullet weight and lead loss, but the single bullet theory survived the rigorous scrutiny of those early and very smart conspiracy theorists, and it went on to survive 6 more decades of scrutiny after that. So if Anna Paulina Luna claims to have found evidence that the single bullet theory is wrong, then her evidence at the very least would have to be new evidence. It would have to be evidence that we've never seen before. But so far, in her various pronouncements about the case, Luna has not mentioned any new evidence that touches on the single bullet theory. She's only mentioned 2 pieces of evidence that are as old as the hills. In fact, the pieces of evidence she's talked about are so old that they were already around in 1964 when the Warren Commission was conducting its inquiry into Kennedy's murder. The Commission was well aware of the existence of both of these pieces of evidence, and it quite correctly decided that no serious conclusions could be drawn from them. The first piece of evidence that Luna has mentioned concerns a group of doctors from Dallas. She has said, quote, "I'm looking to actually bring in some of the attending physicians at the initial assassination." As usual, her language there is a bit less than precise, but the physicians that she's talking about are the emergency surgeons who tried to save Kennedy's life at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas on the afternoon of the assassination. In February, Luna told reporters, quote, "We actually made contact with one of the doctors who's in his 90s. So what makes Luna think that a retired emergency doctor in his 90s might be able to tell us something vital about Kennedy's assassination? Well, I talked about the Parkland doctors back in episode 8, and I explained why conspiracy theorists have always been so interested in them. It's because on the afternoon of the assassination, right after Kennedy died, the chief emergency surgeon, Dr. Malcolm Perry, held a press conference, and when he was asked about the nature of Kennedy's wounds, he mentioned that in addition to a massive head wound, Kennedy had arrived in the emergency room with a hole in his throat that, according to Dr. Perry, quote, "appeared to be an entrance wound." A week later, one of the other emergency doctors from Parkland was quoted in a newspaper as saying that Kennedy's throat wound, quote, "certainly did look like an entrance wound." These statements from the Parkland doctors became a huge deal in early conspiracy theory because if Kennedy had arrived in the emergency room with an entrance wound in his throat, that meant that he had to have been shot at least once from in front. And Oswald, of course, was in the book depository a long way behind Kennedy when the shots that hit Kennedy were fired. An entrance wound in Kennedy's throat meant that there had to have been at least one gunman other than Oswald, and that this gunman had been positioned in front of Kennedy, not behind him. The Parkland doctors have had a remarkably long shelf life in conspiracy theory. Their claims about a frontal entrance wound in Kennedy's throat were first reported on the afternoon of the assassination, and as recently as 2023, the surviving Parkland doctors were in the news again when they repeated their claims about Kennedy's wounds in a documentary called JFK, What the Doctors Saw, which was made to mark the 60th anniversary of Kennedy's death. The Parkland doctors are like the Rolling Stones. They don't know when to quit. And now Congresswoman Luna wants to get them together yet again so that they can play their one and only greatest hit for the umpteenth time. I'm not sure exactly how confused about reality Congresswoman Luna is, but I just don't think it's possible that she can't be aware that the views of these doctors have been stated many times before and that they're inevitably going to say the same thing again if and when Luna's task force puts them on the record. So it's hard to see what she thinks the point of that exercise would be, unless the point of it is to make the American people think that the case for a Kennedy conspiracy is more impressive than it really is. As I've said, the Warren Commission was well aware of what the Parkland doctors had said about the wound in Kennedy's throat. The Commission didn't ignore this evidence, but it did treat it with the kind of scepticism that any serious and responsible commission of inquiry should treat evidence with. It weighed the doctor's claims against all the other evidence that it had, and it found that it had other better evidence which demonstrated that the Parkland doctors simply must have been wrong when they said that the wound in Kennedy's throat looked to them like an entrance wound. One of the great lessons of the Kennedy case, and this is a lesson that some people still need to learn today, is that all evidence is not equal. Some evidence is better than other evidence, and eyewitness testimony in particular is not always reliable. The Warren Commission hauled in a huge trove of evidence about the assassination from hundreds of different sources. There was a lot of junk in the mountain of evidence that it put together, so the Commission and the attorneys who worked for it did not have the option of simply switching off their brains and accepting that every single piece of evidence they'd collected was true and reliable, because some of the evidence they collected contradicted other evidence that they'd collected. It couldn't all be true. Some of it had to be wrong. So the Commission had to use its powers of reason and common sense to decide which bits of evidence it could safely rely on and which bits it couldn't. On the question of Kennedy's bullet wounds, the emergency doctor's belief that Kennedy had been shot at least once from in front was flatly contradicted by the official verdict of Kennedy's autopsy surgeons, who found that he had been shot twice from behind and 0 times from in front. The autopsy doctors identified one entrance wound in Kennedy's upper back and one in the rear of his skull. Mind you, there was one innocuous and meaningless mix-up that occurred at Kennedy's autopsy, as I explained back in episode 8, and conspiracy theorists have been dining out on this mix-up for decades. On the night of the autopsy, the pathologists were temporarily baffled by the fact that the bullet that hit Kennedy in the back didn't have any apparent point of exit. But there would turn out to be a simple solution to this little mystery, because earlier in the day, when the emergency doctors were trying to save Kennedy's life at Parkland, they had cut a large tracheotomy incision through the bullet wound in his throat so that they could insert a tube into his throat and get oxygen into his lungs. The bullet hole in Kennedy's throat was obliterated by that tracheotomy incision. It was made to disappear. So later that night, when the autopsy surgeons were trying to work out where the bullet that hit Kennedy in the back had gone after entering his back, they were unable to draw the obvious conclusion that the bullet had gone out his throat. But during the later stages of the autopsy, the chief pathologist, Dr. James Humes, opened up Kennedy's chest, and he found a contusion near the top of the president's lung, and this made Humes begin to suspect that the bullet must have gone on to punch an exit wound through the throat, and that the tracheotomy incision had then obliterated that wound. So, the morning after the autopsy, Humes telephoned Dr. Perry from Parkland Hospital, and he confirmed that there had indeed been a bullet hole in Kennedy's throat before the tracheotomy incision was made. This provided Dr. Humes with the last piece of the autopsy puzzle. He knew now that the entrance wound in Kennedy's back lined up with an exit wound in his throat. And Humes then incorporated that information into the formal autopsy report before he signed off on it. Okay, so let's put ourselves in the shoes of the Warren Commission here. Which set of doctors should we believe when it comes to the question of Kennedy's wounds and the direction that the bullets were fired from? Should we believe the emergency surgeons who saw some of Kennedy's wounds while desperately trying to save his life at Parkland Hospital, or should we believe the formal findings of the autopsy surgeons who minutely inspected and measured all of Kennedy's wounds after he was dead? Before you answer that question, you should also know that the Parkland doctors never even saw the wounds on the rear side of Kennedy's body because they never had any cause to turn his body over. He came into the emergency room lying on his back on a gurney. He was slipped onto the operating table on his back, and he died on his back. The emergency doctors thought that the wound in Kennedy's throat looked like an entrance wound, but they never had any chance to compare it with the small wound in his back to see if that wound looked more like an entrance wound. So really, this was not a very hard call for the Warren Commission to make. It wasn't even close to a line ball call. Obviously, the emergency doctors made an honest mistake when they looked at the wound in Kennedy's throat and thought that it looked like an entrance wound. And it's really not all that surprising or scandalous that they could have made an honest mistake like that. After all, it wasn't their job to minutely inspect Kennedy's wounds and make a final determination about which direction he'd been shot from. Their only job was to save Kennedy's life, or at least to try. I don't know exactly how many seconds they spent looking at his throat wound before they cut the tracheotomy incision through it, because that's one of the very few questions about this case where there's no definitive answer on the record. But I'd be guessing that they wouldn't have wasted more than a few seconds looking at the wound's characteristics, because if they spent more time than that looking at it, they would have been pretty lousy emergency doctors. On the other hand, it very definitely was the job of the autopsy surgeons to inspect and measure Kennedy's wounds and to make a final determination about which direction shots had come from. And given that the president was dead as they went about their business, they were under a lot less time pressure than the emergency doctors had been. Kennedy was in the emergency room for only 22 minutes before he was pronounced dead, whereas his autopsy lasted for more than 3 hours. And whereas the Parkland doctors told the press that the hole in Kennedy's throat had merely looked like an entrance wound, the autopsy surgeons positively determined and concluded that the wound in Kennedy's back was an entrance wound because it had characteristics, like the wound in the back of his head, that were telltale properties of entrance wounds. The wound in the back of the head had what pathologists call a coning or beveling effect, which means that when the pathologists opened up Kennedy's skull and looked at the inside of its back wall, the hole there was cratered on the inside, indicating that the bullet had passed into the skull from behind and had then gone on to proceed through the brain. And there was, of course, no mystery at all where this bullet had exited Kennedy's head, because it had blown a huge exit wound out the right frontal side of it. As for the wound in Kennedy's upper back, the pathologists found that the skin around the edges of this wound had been pushed inward by the bullet. They also found that the wound had what's known as an abrasion collar, which is a telltale stretching of the skin that occurs in entrance wounds. So there was no doubt whatsoever in the minds of the autopsy surgeons that the wound in Kennedy's back was an entrance wound. And that verdict has since been confirmed by every single official medical panel that has reviewed the evidence. In the late 1970s, for example, the House Select Committee on Assassinations appointed a panel of 9 pathologists to review the medical evidence, and the members of that 9-person panel unanimously agreed that the back wound was indeed an entrance wound. And by the way, when Dr. Perry himself, the chief emergency surgeon at Parkland, when he testified to the Warren Commission, he was shown a copy of Hume's autopsy report, and he said that he felt that the autopsy findings, quote, very nicely explained the circumstances as we observed them at the time. In other words, even Dr. Perry himself, the man who got the ball rolling on the whole idea that the throat wound was an entrance wound, even he was happy to admit, when he was shown a copy of the autopsy report, that he'd been plain wrong and that the verdict of the autopsy surgeons obviously trumped the snap impression of Kennedy's wounds that he and the other emergency doctors had got in the emergency room. So in the world of fact, the medical evidence about Kennedy's wounds has been crystal clear for decades. Kennedy was struck by 2 bullets and 2 bullets only, and both of those bullets hit him from behind. The emergency doctors were simply wrong when they said that the throat wound looked like an entrance wound. That is the true, complicated story. But let's listen to how Congresswoman Luna has fancifully remoulded this story. In an interview with Glenn Beck, she said, "There were reports from doctors at the time, some of which were first and second year med students at the hospital in the room where Kennedy was brought, and they reported an entry wound in the neck. But the doctors that ran the autopsies at Bethesda, Maryland, had reported seeing an entry wound in his back. And so we're talking about multiple shots here. I think the whole idea that they would try to just ignore the evidence, or at least try to bury that, and not even answer the question, is suspect to me." Well, if Luna insists on finding all of this suspect, her suspicions are rooted not in the facts, but in her own ignorance and paranoia. It simply is not true that the Warren Commission ignored the evidence of the Parkland doctors, or tried to bury it, or didn't even try to answer the question that their comments had raised. As we know, when conspiracy theorists say that a question hasn't been answered, what they really mean is that the question hasn't been answered the way they wish it had been answered. The Warren Commission was staffed by grown-up adults who could see that on the question of the throat wound, you had to decide between the claims of the emergency doctors and the verdict of the autopsy surgeons. They couldn't both be right, but Luna seems to think that they can both be right. She told Glenn Beck that the throat wound and the back wound were both entrance wounds, according to her, which means that there had to have been multiple shooters. But if Luna believes that, she needs also to explain to us and to Glenn Beck exactly where she thinks this bullet that entered Kennedy's throat went after it entered his throat. How did it get out of his body? On top of that, she also now needs to explain where the bullet that entered his back went. How did that bullet leave his body if it didn't exit through his throat? Luna's scenario gives us one more entrance wound than there really was, and it leaves us with 2 missing exit wounds. At this point, we really are involving ourselves in absurdities. And why should we involve ourselves in absurdities when there's a perfectly non-absurd explanation on the table, which is that Kennedy was not shot from in front at all? The answer, obviously, is that Luna wants there to have been multiple shooters, and she's ready to believe any absurdity that seems to bear that belief out. The Warren Commission has copped an awful lot of shit over the years, but what would people have said about the commission if, instead of accepting the formal verdict of the autopsy pathologists about Kennedy's wounds, they had instead decided to base their conclusions on what the emergency doctors said they remembered the throat wound looked like to them during the handful of seconds that they spent looking at it before cutting a tracheotomy incision through it? How would we view the Warren Commission if it had taken the line taken by Congresswoman Luna? If it had said, OK, we've heard evidence that Kennedy was shot from both the front and the back, and even though the evidence that he was shot from the front is flimsy, we're going to accept it, and We're going to assume that he was hit from both the front and the back, even though we have no idea where either of the bullets went after hitting him. Any official body of inquiry that offered those conclusions to the American public wouldn't just have been grossly idiotic and irresponsible. It would have been borderline insane. And yet that insane position is exactly the position that Congresswoman Luna is taking right now in public when she chooses to resuscitate and re-amplify the recollections of the Parkland doctors. As usual, it's very hard to know if Luna understands the logical implications of her position or not, but the logical implication of her position is that the official autopsy report must be a fraud, and that's a pretty radical claim to make. When I suggest that the emergency doctors made an honest mistake about Kennedy's throat wound in the heat of the moment, the claim I'm making is not all that remarkable. I'm not accusing anybody of doing anything sinister or grossly incompetent or unethical, but it is a remarkable claim to suggest that the autopsy surgeons were wrong when they concluded that the bullet that hit Kennedy in the back left a visible contusion on the top of his lung and was therefore on a path that must have taken it out the front of his throat. Because if the autopsy pathologists were wrong about that, they could hardly have been wrong about it by mistake or by accident. They must have knowingly signed off on a false report. And all the medical panels who have subsequently reviewed and confirmed that report must have been consciously lying as well. And if all of these people deliberately lied to conceal the true nature of Kennedy's wounds, we're talking about a cover-up on a truly massive scale, a cover-up of a kind that had never happened before in America and has never happened again since. I know, of course, that cover-ups of this kind happen all the time in the imaginations of people like Donald Trump and Congresswoman Luna. But in the real world, the world of documented American history, no conspiracy even remotely like this has ever happened. Luna really has painted herself into a very awkward logical corner by making the claims that she's made about the medical evidence. Although, again, I doubt that she understands how illogical her position really is. She claims to be very interested in files and documents. She claims to be on the brink of declassifying official documents that will unlock all the secrets of Kennedy's murder. But Kennedy's autopsy report is probably the single most important official document that we'll ever have in this case. And Luna has apparently given herself permission to disbelieve this document. But if you believe that the autopsy report is fraudulent, or at least unreliable, then how can any official document in this case ever be trusted? If the autopsy pathologists knowingly signed off on a fake report just 2 days after Kennedy's death, then the official cover-up in this case was huge, and it was happening right from the very start. Every official document in this case, then, might be tainted and probably is. But if that's the case, then you have to wonder why Congresswoman Luna is even bothering to declassify all the remaining official documents about this case, and why she keeps promising people that somewhere in these files the truth might finally be revealed. If the conspirators who killed Kennedy had the inclination and the power and the gall to falsify the autopsy report, then Luna might as well give up on her whole project right now, because clearly no document in this case can be trusted. But that's how incoherent the conspiratorial worldview is. Conspiracy theorists believe that no official document that we currently have can be trusted, but they also imagine that somewhere in the archives there is some official document that we've never seen before that's going to blow the whole case wide open. Here again, it's worth contrasting Luna's deep confusion about the evidence in this case with the pioneering work of the early JFK conspiracy theorists, the people like Mark Lane and Edward Epstein and Sylvia Meagher. In their books about the assassination, which were published in the important period between 1966 and 1968, these writers also made a very big deal out of what the Parkland emergency doctors had said about Kennedy's throat wound. But these writers were well aware of the implications of their position. They clearly understood that if the Parkland doctors were right, that had to mean that the autopsy report was fraudulent. To their credit, these writers came right out and made that claim explicitly in their books, and they accepted the burden of trying to prove that it was true. Edward Epstein, in his book Inquest, made the case against the autopsy report in good faith by using evidence from a flawed FBI report that he didn't know was flawed. Mark Lane, in his book Rush to Judgment, made the case against the autopsy report by essentially lying. He presented his readers with a misleading diagram of Kennedy's wounds, which he pretended had been buried by the Warren Commission, even though it had in fact been published by the Commission as part of the draft autopsy report. But the very fact that Mark Lane felt the need to actively mislead his readers on this point at least suggested that he knew that he was playing tennis with a net. He knew that it was a fairly big deal to claim that Kennedy's formal autopsy report had been falsified, and he knew that you couldn't make such an extraordinary claim without at least making a show of presenting some extraordinary evidence for it. But that was the golden age of Kennedy conspiracy theory, when even the most dodgy of Kennedy conspiracists was still ready to present at least the semblance of a rational argument. Congresswoman Luna, when it comes to the Kennedy assassination, isn't just playing tennis without a net. She doesn't even seem to realise that there is a court here with clearly marked lines on it. She doesn't seem to realise that people on her side of the argument have been playing this game for decades without managing to score a point. She seems to think that the case is a blank slate or an etch-a-sketch. In fact, she seems to think that history itself is an etch-a-sketch. The way she's talking, she seems to think that she herself has discovered these anomalous claims of the Parkland doctors. She's talking as if all this wasn't ventilated and resolved 61 years ago. I'm also not sure just how Congresswoman Luna thinks that her interest in the recollections of these emergency doctors fits in with her job description. She's supposed to be the chairwoman of the House Task Force on the declassification of federal secrets. But if it's her job to declassify secret documents that we've never seen before, why does she make it one of her first priorities to talk with a group of nonagenarian doctors who claim to have an anecdotal memory of something that they saw during a hectic 20 minutes of their lives back in 1963? I want to repeat that date, 1963. What sort of evidence is this, and why is Luna so interested in it? It isn't documentary evidence, it isn't classified evidence, and it certainly isn't new evidence. As far as I can see, there's only one reason why Luna would choose to re-up and re-amplify this anecdotal second-rate evidence, and that is she wants the official story to be untrue. She isn't interested in evidence per se. She's only interested in evidence that appears to contradict the official story, no matter how ancient or discredited or second tier that evidence happens to be. Or to put that all a lot more concisely, Congresswoman Luna is a conspiracy theorist. Now, I know that people who are conspiracy theorists always resent being called conspiracy theorists. They think that conspiracy theory is just a pejorative smear that people like me throw around to discredit and stigmatise their views. But I say that you discredit and stigmatise yourself when you systematically and quite openly choose to believe bad evidence ahead of good evidence just because that bad evidence points to conspiracy. So I think that there should be a pejorative label for people who do this, especially when those people are in positions of great power. Now, to be fair, again, to Congresswoman Luna, the testimony of the Parkland doctors isn't the only evidence that she's mentioned to back up her claim that there were two shooters. She's also made reference to an FBI report that she believes supports her position. She said, quote, "There's been conflicting evidence, and I think that even the FBI at the time reported some anomalies in the initial autopsy at Bethesda, Maryland." As usual, we need to iron out Luna's language here before we deal with the substance of what she's saying. When she says that there were anomalies in the initial autopsy, she seems to be suggesting that there was more than one autopsy, but of course there wasn't, and I don't think she's actually seriously trying to suggest that there was. So let's assume that she's just being sloppy again with her language here, and let's leave the word initial out of it. Let's assume that what she really meant to say was, even the FBI reported some anomalies in the autopsy. This claim is not totally accurate, but it does give us a garbled version of something that really did happen. But before I tell the true story of what happened, let's pause to savour the irony of Luna favourably citing something that she thinks was reported by the FBI. I thought that the whole premise of this declassification exercise was that until Trump and Luna came onto the scene, the American people have always been systematically lied to about the assassination by the agencies of their government, and that surely would include the FBI. But apparently, Luna thinks that the word of the FBI can be taken at face value when the FBI says something that she wants to be true, namely that there were some anomalies in the autopsy. I haven't heard Luna favourably cite anything else that the FBI said about the assassination. I haven't heard her mention any of the countless FBI fibre and ballistics experts who testified that Oswald was as guilty as sin of shooting Kennedy. So here again, I think it's embarrassingly obvious where Luna's priorities lie. The Matterhorn of evidence that proved Oswald's guilt doesn't interest her in the slightest. All that interests her is zeroing in on any tiny scrap of peripheral or anomalous or discredited evidence that seems to contradict that established truth, even when this contrary evidence happens to have emanated from the FBI, which obviously would have had to have been a central player in the official cover-up and conspiracy if there really was one. To compound the irony, the FBI report that Luna is talking about here has long been known to be incorrect. The FBI itself admitted that 58 years ago. In other words, it's only when an agency like the FBI makes a crude and self-confessed mistake about the evidence that Luna suddenly finds it useful to cite the FBI as an authority. And she doesn't cite the correction, she cites the mistake as if it were the truth. I'm told the full story of how the FBI cocked up its account of Kennedy's autopsy back in episode 8, but the quick version is that when the Warren Commission was being established by President Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover urged his agents in the FBI to wrap up their investigation of the assassination fast so that the Bureau could outflank and embarrass the Warren Commission. But in its haste to wrap the case up, the FBI produced two amazingly incompetent written reports about the assassination that, among other errors, reported the results of the autopsy incorrectly. These inaccurate FBI reports made it appear that there had been anomalies in the autopsy itself, but in fact there hadn't been anything wrong with the autopsy. It was the FBI's muddled understanding of it that was wrong. The Bureau's misunderstanding of the autopsy was based on a faulty report submitted by two FBI agents who had been present in the room on the night of Kennedy's autopsy. In their report, those agents accurately described everything that they saw and heard in the autopsy room that night. Their mistake was to assume that when the pathologists finished their work that night, the findings of the autopsy were complete. That wasn't an unreasonable assumption to make. 99 times out of 100, it probably would have been correct. But as I've already mentioned in this episode, there was one key finding of Kennedy's autopsy that wasn't arrived at until the next morning, when the chief autopsy surgeon, Dr. Humes, telephoned Malcolm Perry, the chief emergency surgeon, to confirm his suspicion that there had been a bullet hole in Kennedy's throat before Perry made the tracheotomy incision. So that phone call provided Humes with the crucial last piece of the autopsy puzzle, but the FBI's autopsy observers were, of course, not present when that phone call was made, and that meant that their written account of the autopsy was fatally incomplete. They reported that the autopsy surgeons had never been able to determine a point of exit for the bullet that hit Kennedy in his back, and that just wasn't true. This error was then repeated as if it were a fact in two subsequent formal reports about the assassination that the FBI submitted to the Department of Justice. So that's the complicated historical truth behind Congresswoman Luna's claim that even the FBI reported that there had been some anomalies in the autopsy. There is a true story to be told here about how America's official agencies, especially the FBI, partly screwed up their investigation of Kennedy's murder and created a lot of needless confusion about it. If Congresswoman Luna really is interested in understanding that true story, she could do a lot worse than listen to a few episodes of this podcast, starting with episode 8. But I doubt that the story I told in that episode would have any appeal for Luna, because the story I told there was true but complicated, whereas the stories that she seems to prefer are simple but false. According to Luna, if we want to know the truth about what happened at Kennedy's autopsy, we shouldn't listen to the pathologist who actually conducted the autopsy. Instead, we should listen to a couple of FBI agents who only watched the pathologists perform the autopsy and left before they arrived at their key finding. Talk about a bizarre and arbitrary approach to the evidence. Again, the question that needs to be asked here is why? Why on earth would Luna choose to believe and amplify evidence that is so obviously secondary and inferior? And again, the only possible answer is that she wants that inferior evidence to be true. Again, this is all just conspiracy theory 101. If the truth doesn't suit you, then the best evidence isn't going to suit you either. So you then have to rely on shitty evidence, secondary evidence, flimsy evidence, eyewitness evidence, evidence from sources who are clearly less likely to know what they're talking about. Don't trust the written account of the autopsy surgeons themselves, but do trust a hasty account of the autopsy written by a couple of FBI agents with no medical qualifications whatsoever, who weren't even present for the whole of the autopsy. Don't listen to the vast number of things that the FBI got right about the assassination, but when the FBI makes a mistake and admits that it made a mistake, quote that mistake as if it was the gospel truth. So let's wrap up this part of the argument. Back in February, Congresswoman Luna said, "I can tell you that based on what I've been seeing so far, the single bullet theory is faulty." To back up this assertion, she has mentioned two pieces of evidence only: the testimony of the Parkland doctors and the FBI's botched account of Kennedy's autopsy. And that is it. These two tattered scraps of long discredited evidence are the only two shots that Luna has been able to throw at the single bullet theory. The theory has weathered some much better attacks than this in its time, and it still stands, and I think we can safely say that it's in no danger from Congresswoman Luna. So let's move on from the single bullet, and let's look at one more piece of evidence that Luna has mentioned in her public statements. This evidence involves the CIA. In several different interviews, Luna has said that her task force is interested in locating a document that's supposedly emanated from the office of the CIA's Inspector General sometime in the late 1970s. Here is what Luna has said about this document She said this in February, quote, "One thing that I'm specifically looking for with my team is a CIA Inspector General report that was actually filed from members within the CIA. That admitted that the CIA was intentionally hiding information from Congress during the Warren Commission. So that document itself is going to be key for our hearing, whether or not we find out who actually pulled the trigger." Yet again, and probably for the final time, I'm going to have to straighten out a grotesque blunder that Luna made in this statement before I move on and talk about the substance of it. She said that this document she's talking about proves that the CIA intentionally hid information from Congress during the Warren Commission. But as we're going to see, what she really meant to say about this document is that it shows that the CIA withheld information from the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s, more than a decade after the Warren Commission had ceased to exist. And again, I don't think it's at all irrelevant to notice that Luna finds it hard to sort out the difference between the House Select Committee and the Warren Commission, because if she can't even keep track of straightforward distinctions like that, how are we supposed to trust her when she summarises the contents of a controversial document that we can't read for ourselves? So anyway, what is this CIA document that she's been talking about? To explain that, I need to talk about an assassination researcher named Jefferson Morley. Morley has been called the reigning expert on JFK Files. He's a former reporter for the Washington Post, and he now works as an independent journalist. For a long time, he ran a website called JFK Facts, which has recently morphed into a Substack and a podcast with the same name, JFK Facts. Morley really doesn't like being called a Kennedy conspiracy theorist, but that's tough luck for him because he is one. He's on the record as saying that a small clique within the CIA was responsible for Kennedy's murder and that he doubts that Oswald shot Kennedy at all. The forensic evidence doesn't support that, he said, which means in practice that he, like Luna, has chosen to believe that the anecdotal statements of the Parkland emergency doctors amount to better forensic evidence than the actual forensic evidence. Politically, Jefferson Morley would undoubtedly think of himself as a progressive. He once worked as the Washington editor of The Nation and Salon. But his theories about the Kennedy assassination confirm a point that I've been making all along in this podcast, which is that the pseudo-progressive purveyors of conspiracy theory in this case, the people like Jefferson Morley and Oliver Stone and Mark Lane, have been instrumental in paving the way for the right-wing conspiratorial lunatics who have suddenly now risen to power in America. The people like Donald Trump and Roger Stone and Steve Bannon and Anna Paulina Luna. The two ends of the political horseshoe have always come very close to touching each other in this case. And to prove it, Jefferson Morley seems to have been acting as a kind of intellectual mentor to Congresswoman Luna over the past couple of months. In March, Luna appeared as a guest on Morley's podcast, and in early April, Morley appeared as one of the first expert witnesses called by Luna's task force. And it seems to have been Morley who tipped Luna off about the alleged importance of this classified CIA document that she's been talking about. Certainly it was Morley who first broke the news of this document's existence. In October last year, he published an article on his Substack under the headline, "Exclusive. Whistleblower cites explosive document and describes the CIA's secret JFK archive." Morley's article cited an unnamed source or whistleblower who claimed to have been inside one of the CIA's secure document storage facilities. Inside that facility, Morley's source allegedly found and read a 40 to 50 page document that was produced by the Office of the CIA's Inspector General in the late 1970s, during or perhaps slightly after the House Select Committee on Assassination's reinvestigation of Kennedy's murder. According to Morley's source, this document addressed the question of whether the House Select Committee on Assassination's investigation had compromised secret CIA operations. Morley's source told him that the document was, quote, a blueprint for how to hide things from the public and how to prevent investigative committees appointed by Congress from seeing documents that might incriminate officers of the government. I don't doubt that Morley's source was probably telling the truth. The document that he or she describes does sound like the kind of internal document that the CIA might easily have produced at that time. So I'm willing to believe that this document really does exist in the CIA archives and that Morley's source really did read it. The question is, what, if anything, does this document tell us about the Kennedy assassination? Congresswoman Luna seems to think that it can tell us an incredible amount. She's even hinted in one interview that the document might supply the smoking gun that finally proves that the CIA was implicated in Kennedy's assassination. But she seems to be getting a little bit carried away there. The only person in the world who currently claims to have read this document is the whistleblower quoted by Jefferson Morley. And Morley's whistleblower certainly didn't tell him that this document was any kind of smoking gun. All that the whistleblower said to Morley was that the document was, quote, a blueprint for how to hide things from the public, and that, quote, whatever it was the CIA was concealing from the House Select Committee on Assassinations mattered a great deal to them. They were worried about the information in the documents withheld, end quote. So Morley's whistleblower, who is, as I say, the only person in the world who claims currently to have read this document, this whistleblower didn't claim to know what the information was that the CIA had withheld from the House Select Committee on Assassinations. So therefore, this whistleblower could hardly claim to know whether this information had any direct bearing on who shot Kennedy and why. All the whistleblower said was that the information withheld by the CIA evidently mattered a great deal to the agency for reasons unknown. So you can believe, if you want to, that the information the CIA withheld had something vital to do with the assassination, and that this information would change our view of history if it ever came to light. But that is the very definition of wish thinking, and experience should tell us that the CIA withholds information all the time as a matter of policy, generally for very boring operational reasons that are indeed important to it, but that are not all that meaningful or interesting in any wider sense. On April the 1st this year, April Fool's Day, Congresswoman Luna and her task force held a public hearing in Congress to take the testimony of two so-called expert witnesses, Jefferson Morley and Oliver Stone. At that hearing, the left and right tips of the conspiratorial horseshoe didn't just come close to touching each other, they did touch each other. They came together and fused, and the horseshoe became a ring, a giant conspiratorial circle jerk, with the veteran left-wing conspiratorial hacks, Morley and Stone, playing straight into the hands of the right-wing conspiratorial yahoos and lunatics who are now running the asylum in Washington. Jefferson Morley told the task force that he now feels sure, after reading these declassified files, that the, quote, intellectual author of Kennedy's murder, whatever that phrase is supposed to mean, was, quote, probably the CIA and the Pentagon. You have to love Morley's use of the word probably. After all these years and after the declassification of these final files, a probable answer about the intellectual authorship of the assassination is the best that Morley can offer to replace the certain answer about exactly who shot Kennedy that we've had for 60 years. I mean, this was Morley's big chance to finally tell the world exactly what is objectively wrong with that answer, and he couldn't. All that he seems clear on after all these years is that he hates the official story with every fibre of his being. As for Oliver Stone, he urged Luna's committee to, quote, reopen the investigation that the Warren Commission failed miserably to complete. And the MAGA Republicans in Luna's task force were loving this left-wing conspiratorial shit from Morley and Stone. They were lapping this stuff up because, from their point of view, Stone and Morley were providing pseudo-intellectual validation of some of the most insane and dangerous claims of the Trump cult. If the deep state really did assassinate John F. Kennedy, that would make it way more likely and believable that the deep state is now constantly trying to steal elections from Donald Trump. If the CIA was the intellectual author of Kennedy's murder, and if it blamed that murder on a lone nut, then that would make it way more likely and believable that the CIA or some other agency of the deep state was behind that lone nut who tried to shoot Donald Trump in July last year. In reference to that attempt on Trump's life, one of the Republicans in Luna's task force said to Morley and Stone, "Do any of you guys on the panel believe that we're seeing history repeat itself?" And Oliver Stone replied, "I would see similarities here." Meanwhile, another Republican on Luna's task force told the hearing, quote, "The deep state is here today. They're right before our eyes." I wonder if Jefferson Morley and Oliver Stone felt any pangs of shame as they sat there in that hearing and listened to the paranoid right-wing bilge that was coming back at them. I wonder if they paused to ask themselves, is this what it was all for? Is this what we really pictured when we dreamed that someday, one day, there would finally be a government in this country that would take our beliefs about Kennedy's assassination seriously? I've spent a long time now thinking and writing about the Kennedy assassination and trying to convince people that it still matters and that it's never really gone away. A publisher once said to me, "Do we really need to keep talking about Kennedy's assassination? After all, it did happen 60 years ago." At the time, I gave this guy a fairly short reply. I didn't quite tell him to blow me, but that was the gist of what I said. If I'd thought that it was worth giving him a more nuanced answer, here's what I would have said. I would have said, yes, I'm well aware that the Kennedy assassination did happen more than 60 years ago, physically speaking, but intellectually the fallout of the assassination is still with us. It's never gone away because the purveyors of conspiracy theory have never let it go away. Norman Mailer, who began by believing that there had been a conspiracy but came to accept the fact that Oswald had shot Kennedy and probably did it alone, wrote one of the best single sentences I've ever read about the assassination. He wrote, "It may never have occurred to Oswald that the obfuscation and paranoia which followed the assassination of Kennedy would contribute immensely to the sludge and smog of the world's spirit." All the things that Mailer mentioned there continue to surround our sense of the assassination: the sludge, the smog, the obfuscation, and the paranoia. If that's what Oswald wanted his legacy to be, he's got it. Obfuscation and paranoia are now official government policy in America. That clown show in Congress on April the 1st confirmed it. The denialists and merchants of unreasonable doubt, the people like Oliver Stone and Jefferson Morley, have won. They've got their way. They may not know it. They may think that their work hasn't yet been done, but it's been done all right in the only way it ever will be done, people like Stone and Morley haven't succeeded in making their views about the assassination come true, but that's never going to happen because despite the idiocy of the current moment, it does remain the case that you can't make something that isn't true come true simply by wishing for it. But if you repeat something that isn't true often enough and loudly enough and from a big enough pulpit, then you can succeed in undermining and destroying people's sense of the truth. And there's no question that that is what's currently happening in America, not just with respect to the Kennedy case, but generally across the board. Years of unchecked conspiracy theory have helped to turn America into a place that just refuses to believe in realities it doesn't want to believe in, not just on Twitter or in the comments sections, but at the very highest levels of government. So this podcast has been the story of a movement that both didn't win and did win. And I hope that people like Oliver Stone and Jefferson Morley are at least happy living in the world of fantasy that they've constructed for themselves, because those of us with less vivid imaginations are obliged to live in the real world. And from where I sit, the real world is looking shittier by the week, partly thanks to them. The Kennedy conspiracy theorists set out to change the past, and they couldn't do that. But they have changed the present, and they've helped give us a future that promises to be much more moronic and irrational and dangerous than it ever needed to be. My name is David Free, and this, for now, has been The Ghosts of Dallas.